Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Griffin. I'm the founder and CEO of the 311 Institute, a futures and deep futures think tank where we look up to 50 years into the future. We look across sectors, we look across technologies. I'm also the founder of the World Futures Forum and one of the world's first virtual reality universities, Exponential University. So I have my fingers in many different futuristic pies. Now, during this particular presentation, I'm very honoured and privileged to be able to talk to you about the future of supply chains and trade. Now, I'm going to be telling you some of the things that you already know. I'm going to be showing you some of the things you already know. I'm also going to be showing you a lot of different things that you don't already know. So I hope you enjoy it. Now, and just, I suppose, basically before we kick off, go and get some toilet roll. Now, when we actually have a look at the global supply chain, inevitably there are kind of 6 major mega trends that are actually affecting it today. So, for example, digitization, emerging technology, globalization, new consumer behaviors, resilience, and sustainability. And we're going to be talking through all of these in detail throughout the course of this presentation. Now, as supply chain professionals, it's inevitable that you've been impacted by COVID. We've all been impacted by COVID. Every single organization on the planet has been impacted by COVID. And the supply chains, the global supply chains, have been hit especially hard by the pandemic, both during the pandemic as well as sort of after the pandemic, as we kind of now start seeing some light at the end of the proverbial tunnel. So I'm going to do a little bit of a recap. Now, we saw a huge number of factory slowdowns during the height of the pandemic. We saw China PMI fall by over 22 points. When we have a look at supply shortages, yes, we've got supply shortages of chips, both the potato kind, but also the computer kind that go into cars, which means that organizations like Toyota, Volkswagen, and many other organizations in some cases have actually had to stop production. We've also had shortages of loo roll. If you sort of remember back in early 2020, how many of you queued up for loo roll? I mean, did you ever think that that was going to happen? I didn't, which is why I didn't stock up. However, I'm now still going through my entire stockpile of loo roll. So if you do want some supplies, just give me a call. I can sell it to you for a very, very reasonable price. Not. We've also had huge dips in things like air freight capacity. So air freight capacity fell by over 35%. But then on the top of all of that, because we had over half the world's population in lockdown at some point, we saw a massive e-commerce ramp. Now, on the one hand, basically we experienced, depending on the geographies that you actually live in, we saw growth of anywhere between 45 to 58% year on year, which is staggering. We've never ever seen that before. And in fact, the growth in e-commerce was so significant, for example, in the United States, that Amazon, the market leader, ended up losing 7% market share. They went from 42% of the e-commerce market in the United States to 35%. And it's not because we weren't using Amazon less. It's because all of the other platforms were being used more. All the other organizations that suddenly decided that they needed to be able to sell things online because they had to shutter their shops drove that particular trend. Now, when we sort of look before the pandemic, as well as during, but really sort of, the 2019, the old new normal, as we used to call it, 85% of all supply chains were optimized for just-in-time delivery, offshoring, optimal production, and optimal sourcing. And this is probably what you did, because it kind of made sense. Buy the goods from the people that you trust, and then get those goods to wherever you need them to be just in time so that you don't have to hold inventory, so that your ROS isn't affected, and all those sorts of things. Just 15% of organizations, though, in these good old days, used or had distributed supply chains, diversified, flexible, and local supply chains. And actually, it's these 15% of organizations that managed to weather the supply chain crisis that we see today better than their peers. Now, when we actually have a look at the pandemic, I've got to ask you this question. How quickly are you going to forget all of the lessons from the pandemic? Most people believe that once the World Health Organization says the pandemic is finally over, you can all get out of your houses now. I was going to say you can all go home now. That's it. But let's face it, we probably want to be getting out. Yeah. It's between 6 to 9 months after the WHO announced the end to the global pandemic, whenever that's going to be, and hopefully that's going to be this year. Most behavioral psychologists believe that people are going to forget the lessons and pretty much forget it. It's like putting that bad old memory into a cupboard, basically locking the door. That's it, putting a huge iron safe door over the front of it and then burning it. That's what we're going to be doing with those memories, let's face it. However, when we actually have a look at interruptions to the supply chain, COVID is unique, but it's also not as unique as many people think. Depending on the type of organization that you are and your own supply chains, we saw huge floods in Thailand, shutter factories, which affected the technology industry especially. We also started seeing things like MERS coming through as well. So as we start looking into a future that is increasingly dominated by things like climate change, extreme weather, and so on and so forth, your supply chains are going to become even more disrupted. So the return to the sort of new normal might not really be what you actually expect. Now, when we start having a look at things like digitization, this is where a lot of organizations are now embracing artificial intelligence, but particularly machine learning, predictive analytics, as well as explainable artificial intelligence, and also conversational artificial intelligence, which is more of a sort of 2022, 2023 trend that lets us actually talk to our supply chains, which I'll come on to in a minute. But when we actually have a look at the use of artificial intelligence, basically within a digital supply chain construct, on the one hand, it allows us to create new kinds of forecasts faster, but even more importantly, in these uncertain times that we live in, and in these VUCA times that we are going to continue to live in, artificial intelligence helps you predict risks, model risks. You can run more scenarios faster for less cost than ever before. And you can have these high and low watermarks. What happens if another global pandemic comes through, or not. So when we start having a look at the use of artificial intelligence basically within supply chains, whether it's to identify inefficiency, whether it's to identify areas of cost takeout, whether it's to identify supplier patterns and consumer behavior patterns and manufacturing patterns and all these kinds of things, increasingly, your supply chains are going to become even more intelligent than they are today, as well as automated to a degree. Now, we're also seeing the dramatic rise of blockchain. So blockchain basically is a trend, it's a technology, but it's also a trend. It is increasing at about 35% compound per year. Basically within the supply chain industry, we have organizations like IBM and Maersk. So Maersk have been busy building blockchain-based supply chain systems. And blockchain's a really interesting supply chain technology. So this is why we sort of see organizations like SAP, basically with their ERP systems now embracing blockchain. Because blockchain allows you to, on the one hand, capture data from a whole variety of different points throughout your supply chain, store it in an immutable way that can be audited in real time, and that enables real-time transactions. So for example, with organizations like Maersk, once you've digitized a lot of your manual processes and your paperwork and all these sorts of things that logistics companies kind of hate, let's face it, all of a sudden, basically the trade-off and the handoff between shippers, logistics organizations, and for example, customs becomes much more straightforward. And in fact, it not only becomes increasingly low cost, these things save about 30% of your operational costs, they also become real time, which then helps us improve the flow of goods, particularly as we start coming out of the pandemic. Now, control towers, we are seeing the dramatic rise basically of what we call supply chain control towers. So these are very much digital operating centers, basically, where a little bit like some of the ones that we actually see across the Middle East, as well as with a lot of the logistics organizations like UPS, you can walk into these massive digital control rooms and with almost a single view, see the state of your entire operation. Now, at the moment, as we digitize these control towers, as we digitize our supply chains and we put them up on these fancy operating boards, the end game, arguably, basically, for some of these digital control towers, we call it tier 4, is full automation. Now, that means that we connect the factories together with consumer demand and forecasts, with suppliers, basically with the own internal IT and OT operational stacks, basically within our organizations, so that we get to the point where we can start forecasting that this number of consumers are going to be ordering these kinds of products. Therefore, we need just-in-time manufacturing from these manufacturing partners. The system can automatically prep those manufacturers. Blockchain and smart contracts can automatically negotiate the contracts along with robo-lawyers, which is a kind of artificial intelligence lawyer that we see, place the orders, and then when those orders do actually come in, those goods are automatically shipped to the factories or wherever they're actually needed, and off we go. So digital control towers are one way, one tool that we have in our arsenal to create seamless, frictionless, fully autonomous supply chains. And then as we start coming out of the pandemic, one of the big consumer trends that we're actually seeing, aside from the massive rise in e-commerce and digital channels of all kinds, is the concept of commercialization, is the concept of customization. Now, when we have a look at Industry 4, for example, over 80% of consumers now want to be able to buy customized, personalized goods and products. Now, these include things like personalized Oreo cookies. These include things like personalized Nike ID trainers. Now, what's interesting about this particular consumer trend is that you can drive 64% higher profits. From a customer loyalty perspective, 74% of customers who've actually bought a customized or tailored product from you will inevitably buy again. And then they'll also recommend, 70% of them will actually recommend your company to friends. So this is a significant upticking trend. Now, it's more related to manufacturing, the future of manufacturing, than to supply chains. But from a supply chain perspective, the reason why I'm actually highlighting this to you is because it requires you to change your operating processes, your procurement processes, your supply partners, for example. It also kind of brings us back to this just-in-time manufacturing concept that so far, particularly during times of turbulence, haven't served us very well. So this is a massive upticking consumer trend that is a little bit at odds with creating resilient supply chains. Now, when we start having a look at transparent supply chains, we have organizations like Tetra Pak, for example, that will build RFID tags basically into all of their packaging. So as that packet goes through the supply chain, it's tracked from the factory all the way through to the consumer. But the reason why I'm showing you this is because when we actually have a look at the ability to tag different products in different ways for different purposes, whether, for example, it's the use of DNA tags in clothing so that we can identify whether or not that clothing has come from conflict zones like Western China with the Uyghurs at the moment, or whether we're tagging products basically so that we can identify where they came from, what they're made of, so that we can then recycle them faster, which then plays into the circular economy. There are lots and lots of different and slightly odd ways that we can track goods throughout an entire supply chain. We, of course, have things like RFID tags. But if you're a strawberry farmer or a fruit farmer or a crop farmer, you also have these. Now, you should be able to see the little stripes on the strawberry. That is a 3D printed, edible electronic tag. And it will track everything about that particular strawberry from the field all the way through to literally the customer's stomach. So when we start talking about being able to build transparency into supply chains, we not only have new technologies like edible food tags, we then combine that with things like blockchain, and we fundamentally revolutionize the transparency as well as the provenance, basically, that we attribute to our supply chains, as well as asset management. Now, from a resilience perspective, every single year, I'm looking at you, and me, that's it, although I don't really get the time to go shopping, apparently buy over 1.5 tons of product. Now, that equates to over 11 billion tons of finished products per year. These 11 billion tons of products actually come out of around 100 billion tons of resources that we mine and scrape out of the earth and everything else. Now, some of those resources go to buildings, some of those resources go to energy generation and so on and so forth. But in terms of just shipping products to consumers, we ship over 11 billion tons of products around the world every year. And we have a growing population. We have 600 million more people coming into the middle class, particularly in Asia, over the next 10 years. So this figure is only going to grow, which then again is going to squeeze your supply chains in new ways. However, when we actually have a look at building resilience, as we start digitizing our supply chains, as we build transparency into our supply chains, as our supply chains continue to be global, as they continue to morph, as they continue to rely on things like Industry 4 and all manner of enterprise systems, we are seeing a massive uptick in the amount of cyber risk. Now, just to put this into perspective, the serious organized crime revenues from cyber attacks between 2016 and the year 2020 grew by 65%, and serious organized crime groups now make well over $1.3 trillion a year from attacking you. And that's increasing at a staggering rate. That is not showing any signs of slowing down whatsoever. So the only thing that you can be certain of is that as you digitize more of your business, as you rely on more Internet of Things constructs, etc., it's less likely to be a case of if you're attacked, more a case of when you're attacked. So this is really where you need to look at building cyber resilience into your supply chains. And that's kind of a different conversation. There are a lot of different solutions there. But moving on to the next slide, you also, if you want to build a resilient supply chain, you need multi-sourcing. If Thailand floods again because of floods, and your source A is taken offline, where is your source B? Fairly obvious, but you need to be diversifying your supply chains. You at least need to have a plan, even if you don't do it, but you still need a plan B. Selective decoupling. Now, we've seen this, we saw this with the global trade wars between the United States and China. We've also seen this with Russia. So selective decoupling is a trend basically that really relates to different organizations making strategic choices to draw away or pull out of particular countries or regions. Now, for example, when we saw tariffs being imposed basically on China and we saw the PMIs fall by 22%, inevitably we saw a lot of organizations starting to try to move manufacturing operations like Hon Hai and Foxconn and Apple and so on and so forth out of China to regions of the world basically that had more certainty about them. With Russia, we see a massive strategic dislocation of almost all organizations. McDonald's pulled it out, Starbucks pulling out, and so on and so forth. So even though as supply chain experts, you might not actually see or pay too much attention to this idea of selective decoupling, it is having a very real impact on you already. And a lot of manufacturers and a lot of organizations are actually moving to places like South Korea, Vietnam, India, as well as the US, as well as Europe. And we've seen that with, for example, organizations like Intel. Intel are investing $80 billion in new chip fabrication facilities in Europe. So selective decoupling has become not just a supply chain issue or trend, it's also become a very hot geopolitical trend. We also then have the concept of flattening supply chains. Now, if you have a look at the majority of products that you might make, depending on what you actually make, particularly if you're a hardware organization, the average car, for example, has over 30,000 components. And as organizations like BMW kind of famously say, all you need is one of those components to be missing, like a tire or like a computer chip or a windshield, and you can't finish your product. So this is where the concept and the trend of flattening supply chains actually comes in. Now, at a very high level, what we talk about when we talk about flattening a supply chain is if I used to make my product out of 300 products, then why can't I make it out of 200 products instead? And that's a product innovation and development problem or question. And as supply chain experts, I'd be a little bit surprised by seeing if any of you really get involved in the upfront product development process. Because if you were able to work with your R&D teams, and your R&D teams put together a product that had 300 components in it, and you said, well, could you possibly make that out of 200 components? And they said, well, if we had access to the right suppliers and the right materials and the right glues and all this sort of strange stuff, then we might be able to. And as supply chain professionals, this is where your expertise really comes into bear, because you should be able to say, well, okay, actually, I know a supplier that can do some of those things. Why don't we go and have a conversation with them? So this is where R&D and procurement really need to start coming together much more, which really is a CFO play and a CEO play. But as procurement officers, I would encourage you to go and have these conversations with your CEOs and CFOs, because this will help your supply chain resilience. Now, when we actually have a look at the future of innovation and R&D, that's changing as well. Now, little might you know that if you want to ship a pair of sneakers from China, it'll typically cost you about $5 per pair. But what if you didn't actually have to ship those sneakers at all? What if there was another way? Now, this is where we end up with the concept of creative machines. So increasingly, creative machines are artificial intelligences that are able to design and innovate new products at digital speed. And by digital speed, I mean that they can create products millions of times faster than humans. Today, these creative artificial intelligences are doing iterative innovation. Typically, they will take an existing product and, like a human, they will figure out what product version number 2.5 could look like, should look like. These creative machines are also increasingly helping you move the dial when it comes to things like sustainability, waste, and all those other bits and bobs. And I'm going to give you some examples. So when we talk about flattening supply chains, when we talk about being able to build new products out of a single component or very few components that leverage some new emerging technologies, I've got some examples for you. So firstly, in Germany, we had an organization called Hyperganic, who used an artificial intelligence to create a new kind of rocket engine, which you see on the left here, over there. Now, that rocket engine is unique because you can 3D print it in the back of your store, and it's made out of one component. That's it. So in this case, from a supply chain perspective, to make future rocket motors, all you need is a 3D printer and a bunch of alloy, which you then put into the 3D printer. We have Under Armour in the middle. Now, Under Armour, it would normally take them about 18 months to go from product concept, to putting the product on the shelf. And obviously, they'd have to get a lot of supply chain partners involved. They'd have to liaise with manufacturing centers and all that kind of stuff. Now, they had an artificial intelligence create a sneaker called the Architect sneaker. It's worth about $300. Now, that artificial intelligence designed this new sneaker in a day. The sneaker is also made out of 3D printable materials. So on day 2, they were able to 3D print those trainers in the back of their stores. Now, not only did this actually eliminate 99% of the time to market, which is substantial itself, it also plays into the personalization and customization trend because we have additive manufacturing in there. But as we've seen with Nike, Adidas and other retailers, if I can 3D print sneakers in the back of my Under Armour store and other clothes and apparel and equipment and products and all that kind of stuff, what happens to my global supply chain? Now, in Adidas's case, they ship hundreds of millions of sneakers basically from all over the world. And they are using this kind of technology as well, which ultimately means they no longer need to ship products from China. So they eliminate the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of their supply chains. And then the shirt, we have Amazon. Amazon brings in huge volumes of equipment from all over the world. During the pandemic, they actually hired their own ships, their own containers. They've been spinning up their own logistics fleets and all kinds of different things. But they have all of the technologies they need now to become a fully autonomous retailer, which is a future retail conversation that we can have. But they have an artificial intelligence that designs clothes. You go and buy those clothes from the website. They then have an on-demand manufacturing system, which they patented a couple of years ago, that will then take just fabric from their warehouse and make those clothes on demand. And then those orders are automatically fulfilled using autonomous fulfillment systems, which we'll discuss later, as well as fully autonomous delivery systems like self-driving vans, robot dogs, which is actually a thing, and all that kind of thing. So in Amazon's case, from an inventory perspective, they just need to hold loads of fabric in their warehouses. And then ultimately, another organization that you will all know, Airbus. At any point in time, a single Airbus aircraft will be made up of over 3 million components. So Airbus have been using creative machines, again, to try to flatten their supply chains and reduce the number of components in their aircraft, but also create those components in a more sustainable way without generating huge amounts of waste. So again, additive manufacturing comes back in here. So again, future manufacturing conversations, but as supply chain experts, you need to really investigate the future of manufacturing because it's changing substantially. We're also sunsetting oil. When we have a look at the Russian-Ukraine crisis, this was a trend beforehand. Organizations everywhere are trying to eliminate oil. And if you eliminate oil, whether it be in the manufacture of plastics or whether it be in energy generation, you no longer need to ship it. When we start talking about resilient supply chains again, we have a look at food. In the UK, we import huge volumes of lettuce, for example, from Spain. Now, that's generally unsustainable. It has a huge carbon footprint associated with it and everything else. But if we can grow that lettuce in a vertical farm based out of London, we no longer need to rely on Spain for our food security or food production. So this helps us build resilient supply chains because from a food production perspective, my food is just next door. And then I have to just organize the shipping from next door to wherever I want it to go. And even coffee, we are seeing significant extreme weather patterns over South America, which is at the moment putting most of the coffee harvests at risk. But using synthetic chemistry, we have organizations that have been able to recreate the precise flavor of coffee that apparently is even better than Starbucks. So these are organizations like Atomico, and create something called molecular coffee. So it's coffee without the coffee bean, just in the same way that increasingly we're able to make meat in laboratories using a clean meat technology without the animal. So we have lots and lots of different ways to flatten supply chains and then buy local. And some of them are surprising. Now, from a sustainability perspective, 97% of CEOs and executive boards say that sustainability is now either their top priority or their top 3 priorities. In other words, it's very important. 97% of CEOs say sustainability is very important. Supply chain professionals, though, only 69% in surveys of supply chain professionals actually take in the ESG credentials of their suppliers when they're actually sourcing new suppliers or when they're sourcing products or goods and everything else. Now, even though 69 is still a big number and a good number, there's almost a 30% disconnect between what the executives at the top of the organization are wanting and what the supply teams are actually doing in the middle of the organization. So this is where increasingly when we talk about sustainable procurement, this is about making better choices. This is about embracing the circular economy, local sourcing, zero waste policies as well. That's it. We have organizations, meanwhile, basically like BMW. BMW are now using incredibly powerful quantum computers. And these quantum computers are fantastic at optimization problems. They can solve optimization problems, such as helping you simplify your very, very complex supply chains. Bearing in mind that BMW's cars use about 30,000 components each, and they are so powerful, they are about 100 million times more powerful than classical computers that you'll be using today. So organizations like BMW are increasingly using quantum computers to help them optimize their supply chains, optimize components and procurement and suppliers, but then also optimize routing as well. So for example, when we actually have a look at routing, these can typically save anywhere between 5 to 10% of the fuel costs. We also have a massive power transfer going as well. So when we actually have a look at the logistics that are associated with our supply chains, we're moving from fossil fuels to all kinds of new kind of fuels, whether it's biofuels, hydrogen, renewables, whether it's the electrification of transportation, ammonia, nuclear, and all kinds of other different electricity and energy innovations, which is a future of energy conversation that we can also have. However, when we actually have a look at the shipping industry, they are now on a tear to eliminate at least 70% of all of their global carbon emissions by 2050, and they want that to be 100%. So they're ditching bunker fuel. So when we actually have a look at organizations like Maersk, for example, on a single 28-day journey, a 8,000 TEU container ship will use 225 tons of bunker fuel, and that will cost organizations like Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, Costco, all those kinds of organizations around $3.5 million for that single trip, let alone the amount of pollution that's coming off of these ships. So at the moment, when we actually have a look at the shipping fleets, they are actually greening the shipping fleets at the moment. So they're greening them by changing the energy that these massive cargo ships use from bunker fuel to using ammonia, biofuels, hydrogen, and LNG. But then when we have a look at things like LNG, for an 8,000 TEU container ship, it will cost organizations like Maersk $25 million to retrofit them. So it's not cheap. And in fact, the average container ship has a lifespan of about 25 years. So if the shipping industry wants to hit its 2050 targets, then they've got to start greening the fleet really in the next 5 years, not even really 10 years. And that means that the shipping industry has got to invest over $235 billion really by 2026, if they want to hit that target, to buy new ships. And then retrofitting ships, it's estimated they're going to have to spend over $114 billion to green that fleet. That is a Herculean task by any measure. So when we have a look at the future of shipping, there's obviously a lot of different technologies and innovations coming through there as well, such as the use of wind power and all those kinds of things. But everything is being greened. When we actually have a look at aviation, we have new aircraft coming through from Airbus that we mentioned earlier, basically that use hydrogen. Trucks, vans, they're all being electrified with lithium-ion batteries. UPS now have wirelessly charged electric vans, courtesy of ONRL over in the US, and all these kinds of different things. So we're not just greening cargo ships. From a fossil fuel perspective and an energy consumption perspective, we are greening all of the different components and logistics vehicles in the supply chain. And then when we have a look at emerging tech, and we're almost there, we have dark warehouses that are on the rise. Now, dark warehouses are fully autonomous warehouses basically that are able to operate at full capacity without any humans or human intervention. Now, these will run 24/7. They typically seem to be about 30% cheaper to run in the long term because you still have to buy the capital. You have to buy the equipment in the first place, so that's a big capital expenditure. But dark warehouses from organizations like Ocado, we're seeing Amazon invest very heavily in dark warehouses. And in fact, Amazon believes that they will be able to have fully dark warehouses in about 10 years because in their case, what's hampering them from adopting dark warehouse technology is the fact that they have so many different SKUs and inventory types and all that sort of stuff. We also have the rise of autonomous ports. We've seen autonomous ports already being built basically on the east coast of China. Now, these ports, not only are they fully autonomous, but they are enabled by technologies such as 5G. And 5G helps speed up the customs process and the transfer process, for example. They're sped up by things like artificial intelligence, drones, I was up at the Port of Hamburg a little while ago, basically where they're actually testing drones, basically to move different things around and for inspections and asset management and all that kind of stuff. We also have teleoperations, so teleoperated cranes, for example, teleoperated ships. We then also, really by 2030, will have all of the technologies that we need to create fully autonomous cargo ships and vessels. Now, in Japan, they want half of their fleet, of their logistics cargo ship fleet, to be fully autonomous by the year 2040. At the moment, these fully autonomous vessels look like they're going to be about 30% cheaper to operate. However, at the moment, because of the expense of the technology and the retrofitting of all the ships and everything else, the vast majority of organizations like Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk only believe that they are going to have a good TCO really from about 2030 onwards. But nevertheless, these are cheaper to operate, they're also more efficient, and then we have more efficient handling at autonomous ports, which then actually streamlines and speeds up the flow of goods. And we have autonomous everything. We have autonomous cranes, we have autonomous trucks, we have autonomous this and that and everything else. And so automation is really coming through not just the supply chain industry, but the logistics industry, the procurement industry, the manufacturing industry, etc., etc., etc. And then if you're organizations like DP World have been investing very heavily in Hyperloop technologies. Now, they want to start building out Hyperloop networks in India first. Now, Hyperloop is a kind of train that operates in a vacuum tunnel and can travel at Mach 1. Now, on the one hand, with companies like DP World, they want to be able to move goods from the ports inland as quickly as possible, so containers don't get stuck and jammed at the ports, which is something that we've actually seen happen in California, and that's been a big problem when we look at ports, because ports haven't been able to clear containers fast enough, which is why we then see cargo ships, off the in traffic jams around the Suez Canal, basically, and off various ports and coasts. But with Hyperloops, trains that essentially can move cargo at Mach 1 speeds, they enable global shipping anywhere once the networks are built, and that's a massive capital investment. They will allow you to move containers from Shanghai to anywhere in the world within 14 hours at the speed of flight for the cost of trucking. That's transformative. But this is a slow burn trend because we have to spend a huge amount of money building these networks out in the first place. But just FYI. And then when we start having a look at what you now need to do, so hopefully I've shown you some things that you already knew, and we've kind of managed just to square the circle on those. Hopefully I've managed to show you things that weren't even on your radar, even if you have a quantum radar, which is a military thing. Now this is what I suggest you do. Go out, go and explore. Explore your industry, your lines of business, but also other industries, other lines of business. Go and experiment. Go and have conversations basically with your research and development teams and say, well, what if we can reduce the number of components? What if we could just 3D print everything basically locally? What if we could change our suppliers from here to there? Whatever it happens to be, go off and experiment. Pick 3 projects and have a play around with them. And then, most importantly, as we head into a new world that is filled with emerging technologies, VUCA, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and speed, you are going to need to unlearn a huge amount of different behaviors and things. Because the opportunities to revolutionize how you buy products, who you buy them from, how you help your organizations increase revenues and benefit from some of these new technologies and these new things is absolutely everywhere. And that's it. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the session, and have a great rest of the day. And if you want to get hold of me, just ping me an email, find me on LinkedIn, find me on YouTube. I'm normally around. I'm a little bit of a digital native, you might say, myself. That's it, which is something you guys basically should be with your own supply chains. And let's strike up a conversation. Take care. All the best, guys. Goodbye.